Tonight, it is my pleasure to introduce Natalie Walton in celebration of her debut YA novel, Revenge of the Sluts, a story that tackles privacy and relationships in the digital age. Joining Natalie in conversation tonight is fellow author, local author, and health sex ed expert, Shafia Zaloom. Shafia, Natalie, I'll pass it on to you and I'll see you at the questions.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Great to see you. Thank you for showing up. It's just been such an incredible opportunity to be in conversation with Natalie about this incredible new book that she has published. And so I figure let's just start with that. I know that Natalie has been writing for years, even though she's in her early 20s, which is actually really inspiring that she has published a book. And I know it's been a dream of hers, like it says in the acknowledgement, since she was 7. So, Natalie, can you share a little bit first about sort of what this experience has been like for you, what it feels like to have published a book, especially as a young author?
Yeah, it's super exciting. It's just kind of this feeling of like, I can't believe it actually happened and it's actually real and like, I have it like physically next to me and I still am like I think processing it a little bit and just trying to kind of wrap my head around the fact that like my name is actually like on a book and I'm not just like making that up.
That's awesome. And can you talk a little bit too about the writing community you were a part of as a young person and then how that evolved into you becoming an author, a published author, no less?
Yeah, absolutely. So, for me, I started off on Wattpad, which means I was kind of interconnected with other writers. And for me personally, I was finding, other writers who were almost exactly my same age. So it was people who were, at the time, we were all, probably like 12 to like 14, I want to say. And we'd all just kind of like chat about our books, kind of, talk about the process, talk about the ideas we have. And I've kind of grown up alongside a lot of writers, which has been really exciting. So I still keep in touch with a lot of them, and we kind of just like regularly check in with each other, and we're just like, "How are things going? Like, how's your book going?" Half the time, it's I haven't written anything in like a couple weeks, that kind of idea, but overall it's really wonderful kind of having a bunch of people to talk to who like completely understand my situation and understand kind of what it feels like to be someone in their early 20s who's already like, yes, I want to write a book, like I want to write novels, this is my thing, that kind of idea.
For sure. And then can you talk a little bit about what Wattpad actually is? So if there are interested, blossoming writers out there, young people who are inspired by what you've done, that they could actually find similar things or embrace the same kind of opportunity.
Yeah, Wattpad is kind of this like writing community, I guess is the best way to describe it. So you can post your work online, just like totally unedited. You don't have to get it kind of like approved by anybody. You can just post it and then share it with people. So you can, share links with your friends, share links with your family, or you can just kind of let people on the internet kind of just stumble upon it using various tags and things like that. And it's just a really great kind of way of finding readers and finding a community. And I find it really helpful for just getting general advice and like kind of understanding how readers are receiving my work. So super helpful for like a first draft and being able to have people who could say things like, "Oh, I totally didn't see this coming," in like a bad way, that kind of idea where they can offer genuine critique and kind of help me out in the process. So that was really really helpful to have. And I don't I writing can feel really lonely, especially when it's a first book because it's just you and you're just hoping that somebody's going to like it down the road. So I think it's really nice to have other writers who you can go back to and kind of just be like, yeah, this is where I am in the process. This is what's happening. I have people I can like FaceTime whenever I'm feeling stuck. It's a really kind of wonderful way of learning how to write and a way of meeting people who like truly understand you and like understand this like huge part of you. So I definitely recommend it.
And you all love books, right? Like everybody loves books. And so, okay, so the book is about revenge porn, and that is not typically um, well, first, if you could tell, because it's not typically a topic that YA authors are addressing. And I definitely, what I love about this book is that it is so real and relevant for young people today. So much so for so many reasons. And you decided to address this topic in particular. And there's so many other nuanced dynamics around high school and everything that are included. But first, can you talk a little bit about what inspired you, and how was it that you came to actually focus on this issue in particular?
There are a couple of different parts to it. So when I first came up with the idea for Revenge of the Sluts, I was like, 13 and kind of in this early stage of understanding what like feminism is, understanding double standards. Like it was kind of this like entry level kind of approach to things, and I wanted to write a book kind of speaking to that. So that was the kind of starting point of it. I didn't really get that far when I was like 12 or 13. I was still learning myself, so it's hard for me to be able to articulate it in a book. But I kind of put the idea to the side. And then as I was growing up, I kind of, started, I guess, getting drawn in the direction of social sciences and just understanding things like sexual violence and gender based violence and what that means in a society and things like that. So I wanted to really touch on that in a book. And then it came together as I was working as an intern for a like child advocacy organization. I was working on these like presentations based on being able to spot signs of like bullying and harassment and things like that. So that was when it really kind of came together for me, and I started to become super aware of what was going on in schools. I was able to kind of pull in my knowledge that I had gotten from like sociology classes and documentaries and like various things. So it really just all kind of like came together as this like perfect storm when I was in college.
Nice. And so also too, what has been the response to the book, and actually that you have tackled this subject that every young person, at least every young person who's on social media, has been exposed to, understands, and knows, if not directly, but through friends. Like what have you got, what sort of feedback have you gotten back around the fact that you actually like talked about something that isn't talked about a whole lot?
Yeah, the feedback for it has been great. I think in the sense that people have been waiting for something to like start this conversation. Like I know for me growing up, and this was another reason why I wanted to write the book, was there were no resources for us on something like revenge porn. I mean, the term didn't even really cross our minds when something was happening. We'd hear these like gossip, we'd hear stories, like we'd know what was kind of going on, but there was nobody who was kind of saying like, hey, this is what's happening, it's actually really really bad, and this is what we should do in order to like go from here, and that kind of idea. There was just nothing really like that, and I think I wanted to be able to provide that for somebody like myself who was very much like Eden, who was just watching this all kind of unfold and didn't really know what to do, didn't know who to go to, wasn't sure like even what my role was in the situation, I guess is the best way to describe it. So, which is something I think a lot of bystanders fall into, of like, how far is too far? What am I supposed to do? Who's going to help me? That kind of idea. But yeah, I think that was, I kind of lost track of the question in the middle of that, but that was kind of
Sort of the feedback that you've been getting, sort of how
yeah,
it's resonated with young people.
yeah, definitely. I think young people have really responded to it in the sense that it's the first time that they're seeing this. So they've read about it in articles, they've heard about it in school, they know it exists, and I think it's a little bit more common of a term now than it was. I know something like Celebgate. I can't remember what year that was, but things like that. Or there was an incident I think a couple of years ago. Like there's various things that have happened where people have been like, okay, I understand what revenge porn is, but we still, I think, need to take the conversation further. And I think people really are looking for that and looking for ways to make that a little bit easier. And I think Revenge of the Sluts can provide kind of like a way of getting into that. So it's an entry point of at least being able to understand what the term means, what it looks like, what you can do.
I think what's also really amazing, because as a sex ed teacher, I love this because it actually, and someone, so I do workshops with parents and talk to parents about how to actually have these conversations with their children about healthy sexuality and relationships, as well as consent and all the issues that revolve around consent. And what I love about the book is that in this fictitious story that is so grounded in truth, right? That then it provides a platform, it provides a vehicle by which we can enter into the conversation with our kids without it feeling so intense and intimate and personal. So it's not about like your own kids' social media use per se directly, but you're really talking about your values and what you think and getting them to think about it critically through these characters. And yes, it's about revenge porn. I think that's the primary storyline. But what I appreciate in particular, because I hear this from young people all the time, all the different contexts and reasons why someone might send a nude photo. And that and the feelings that surround it and the context that elicits it. And that, revenge porn is actually a very specific use of those photos and non-consensual pornography, and why it's called pornography because it's a federal offense, and like there's all kinds of legal aspects to it, there's all kinds of social aspects to it. In the research we call it non-consensual pornography, because there are other contexts too in which it happens where it's not even vengeful, but people just think it's fun to share like their Pokemon cards or something, right? Like images of intimate images that were shared maybe within the context of a relationship, or someone felt like they didn't have a choice, or the attention felt good in the moment, so they went for it, but then realized suddenly they lost control of that narrative, right? Like, and really, you provide insight into the psychology of young people in the social landscape they're navigating, so that we can understand better the dynamic and how these things actually come to be. Because I feel like as adults, a lot of times it's like, well, just say no to that. Why would you do that? Right. And we forget that we're not just saying no to the photo, or we're not just saying like no to taking a picture of ourselves. We're saying no to the person who's asking, and the social currency that person has in the social life you're trying to figure out and live in, right? So I think there's a lot that this book provides in terms of opportunity for discussion. Um, the other part of it, and I'd love to hear a bit, was what inspired the different characters. There's a diverse representation of students as well as adults. And I'd love to hear a little bit about how you conjured up this world and what inspired it.
Yeah, there were a few different parts to it. So, I mean, the starting kind of scene, I almost imagine St. Joe's itself as a school being a character, just because it is such a big part of the story. And that was where I started out, because I knew if I wanted to have this journalism aspect, I really wanted to have that, the, I guess, the drama of it all, in the sense that you have a school that is extremely dependent on students who are enrolling and having funders, things like that. So that was setting the scene to begin with, was setting it in this kind of wealthy private school, kind of understanding the dynamics in there. And then in terms of the actual characters themselves, there were a couple that were really early on. So like Eden was formed pretty early on. I knew Ronnie was going to be a character. Sloane was like probably one of the first, if not the first character who really was like fully formed in my mind, just because she was so like clear to me. But everyone else, interestingly enough, kind of formed alongside the story. So I would have a general idea, but it all felt very natural. And I think that's something that's kind of shown in the book, is how all the characters overlap in kind of interesting and very like high school ways. It's people are on sports teams together, or they worked on group projects together, or they're close because they went to the same middle school and stuff like that. And I think that's just a really kind of accurate representation of what it feels like to grow up. And then the other piece of that was making sure that there were different types of people who were shown. I mean, it wasn't necessarily like a conscious effort where I was like, okay, we need to make sure we like check all these boxes. It was more of a, we need to have an honest conversation about how people will respond to situations differently. And everyone's personality is going to show up in different ways in different situations. So it's not everyone's going to act the same way. And in most cases, very few people are going to respond in exactly the same way to the same thing that they're watching. So I think that was the biggest piece, was making sure that the characters responded in ways that felt very human and very accurate to who they were and people who feel real.
What I really appreciated too is, given what you just said, which I think is so true of the book, and wanting to be responsible to that, right? Like, so I know that given your age, you're not too far removed from it, but you're removed enough that in retrospect, through your own research and through your own knowledge and training and interest and passion, have learned a lot of information that you wanted to share with young people, so they would actually have the language with which to talk about these things in meaningful ways, to identify it, to be an upstander, to be a bystander, like all those different aspects of it. Can you talk a little bit about how you've woven some of that critical information so that you're being responsible to, not, you're not just telling a story that could be triggering and, that then leaves kids in the lurch about this topic. I loved how you very subtly also infuse and empower kids with important information and role model through the characters what to do. Can you talk a little bit about how you wove that together and how you integrated that into the storyline?
Yeah, what's really interesting is all of the kind of like social aspects of the book. So all of these little like undercurrents of commentary and things that were in my classes were originally something where I remember texting my like writing friends about it and being like, I think this might be too heavy. Like for some reason I can't write this book without offering like social commentary and kind of throwing in all of these little things that show up in real life and in high school that we might not see or we might not be able to identify but are definitely there and are very obvious. So it's it was kind of like almost naturally written into the book, and I feel like it's almost part of Eden's character that she sees these things that might not necessarily be at the forefront of people's minds. And I just really wanted to be able to kind of embrace that and fully offer this character who, for her, it feels very natural to kind of question what's around her. Sorry, I don't know if you can hear the sirens that are going on. I'm like right near a main strip. But I'm like trying to talk over it.
You're
Sorry.
good. We
Um,
can hear it. Yeah.
but yeah, I lost my train of thought in the middle of that. But I wanted to be able to kind of talk about social issues in a way that felt very human and approaching it from Eden's perspective and being able to just kind of touch on what I was learning in sociology and what I was seeing and what I kind of knew was happening, but in a way that like almost in the same way that I talk to my friends about it, or in the same way that like we kind of just see it in our everyday and we might not realize the significance of it. Like for example, there will be little comments about like the kinds of funders who are attached to the school and the idea of these parents who are all super interconnected and have these relationships that are all super important, and there's certain students who immediately have more clout than others because of their relationship in that school. So just like little things like that, and then the gender dynamics and things like that, like it all just kind of came together. That was like a total rambling answer, so if you need any clarification just let me know, but that's
One character that you didn't mention so far, like all those things I appreciated in the book certainly too. And there was one character in particular who comes in from the outside, and it's this whole concept of self-care, right? Like that if you are, witnessing something happening in which people are being treated unfairly, and there's trauma or there isn't consent or people are being exploited in some way. How do you actually deal with that? What's the language to use when it comes to that? And how do you take care of yourself? I know that's a really big one. When I have students who come in and talk to me about what they're seeing at parties, about non-consensual stuff that they witness, all those different things, like one of the biggest questions that I have for them is, what does that feel like for you? And how are you taking care of yourself? So could you talk a little bit, is it Kai? Could you talk a little bit about Kai and Kai's role in the book?
Yeah, that scene is really important to me, just in the sense of being able to. It gives Eden finally a chance to actually talk about what's going on. I feel like the story feels so insular and kind of in this like very tight community of people who are all overlapping, who all know each other's business. Kai is really the only external factor, like in the entire book. She's really the only person who has no connection to what's going on. She's kind of just a kind of circling. She knows the story and she knows the situation, but she's not involved really at all. And I think it just provides this opportunity for Eden to grow, and then also for the readers to kind of understand a little bit about what's going on and how the situation can affect so many different people differently. And it's not just it has to be happening to you as a person, but just watching this unfold, understanding what your classmates are going through, having to hear really challenging stories, just being a witness basically can also be really difficult and really draining. And it's hard when you're 17. Nobody really prepares you for this kind of stuff, so it's important to have those conversations and the vocabulary, and showing somebody who can kind of guide that and say it's okay to open up and it's okay to admit that maybe the situation is really hard for you.
And two, that there are different adults also that you represent in the book, and adults who are really true allies to the young people, adults who you don't even know if they would be allies if they could because they're so constrained by their own responsibilities of the positions they hold. there's all kinds of adult representation too. What was your intention with that?
Yeah, I always think it's really important because for me, one of the first things that stands out when I think about kind of my teen experience is that there weren't that many people who are willing to have these conversations. I mean, you've said this in previous talks, but the adults in my life are pioneers. Like they're learning how to do all of this stuff for the first time. So there was nobody really helping us through all of these things because they're also learning how to go through them. And I think it's really important to show that there are adults who are at different stages and you will run into different types of people, but it's adults can learn too, basically. It's kind of one of those, like, there's not a point when it stops. Like, you can still learn how to be an ally. You can learn how to, talk to teenagers and communicate with them without, asking, for example, why questions, which is something we've talked about previously also. And I just, there's one scene in particular with the journalism teacher that always stands out to me because she says something along the lines of like, she's talking to Eden and she's basically like, thank you for teaching me something. And I think that's such an important thing to kind of have in a book is an adult who is very open about the fact that they learn something from teenagers. So I really don't think it stops. I mean, I learn things from the young people in my life all the time. I mean, they're constantly teaching me, even just like my brother has all sorts of like lingo he teaches me, but he also teaches me like what his friends talk about and what's going on with him being in high school now as a 15-year-old versus what it was like for me growing up and where I am versus where he is and things like that. So it's just, I don't like, teenagers have great insight and they're really important to the story.
And are incredibly generous. I mean, I wouldn't have a job unless they shared with me like all the different trials and tribulations and actually can be incredibly insightful and perceptive. I learn from my students all the time, every day, and they have a power that none of us adults do, and that's to know what kids are up to when the adults aren't around. And those are the things that we actually really want to be addressing and talking about the most in many situations. So, in terms of the wide variety, like what is it that has surprised you as now that you've come this far? So congratulations, I know the first print has been sold out and we're going to the second, and I imagine that those are flying off the shelf too. It's super exciting. What was something that is there something that surprised you in all of this process of promoting and discussing and just taking in the how people have received your book.
Yeah, I think, well, the number one thing is learning how much actually goes on in publication. Like, it's one of those where, like, you go from writing the book as, like, basically an individual, and then all of a sudden you have, like, a team of people who are kind of just, like, editing and talking about things and sending it through chains and whatever else. So that was really interesting for me to kind of, like, learn and see unfold. But I think by far the most interesting thing has actually been hearing the differences in kind of feedback based on age group. So it seems like there's been people who've responded differently either to the title, the content of the book, the messaging of the book, just based generally on like who's reading it. Like it seems like it's mostly older readers who are a little bit uncomfortable with the title as opposed to younger readers who barely even seem affected by it. Like that's not something that they really mention whenever they post like a review and tag me in it on like Instagram or something like that. And then there's people who will talk about their experience growing up where they're like, we didn't even have cameras on our phones, that kind of idea. So just being able to hear all of these different kind of things that people have to say, and it's just been really exciting that it's been starting this kind of dialogue and it's kind of bridging this gap between generations.
Nice. Can we talk about the title for a little bit too? Revenge of the Sluts. And I know in our last book talk, we actually talked about this in terms of reclaiming language and what that means for young people. Can you talk a little bit about how you came up with the title and your intention behind it?
Yeah, so it's a title where it was actually probably the first thing that I came up with. Like it was one of those just like I had it in the back of my mind for, I mean, at this point it's been almost probably 10 years since I came up with it and was like, I want to do something with this. I don't know what exactly I'm going to do, but I want to do something with it. Which I think is really interesting because the word slut is derogatory. I mean,
Yeah.
it's like directly against women. It's not something where I should be like, oh, I want to put it in a book title. Like, I want my name affiliated with it. That kind of idea, especially from such a young age. When I mean, you're 12 or 13. It's like we were taught to be scared of it. Like that's a word where it's like you did not want to be that. But I think there's almost this kind of like a shift into it being almost like not funny, but some sort of where people are trying to take the power away from it, and they're, you know, calling each other slut as like a term of endearment, or it's just kind of meant to be um, like, I don't know, just not as like serious or scary anymore, which is a really, really kind of interesting direction to go in. Like at this point, as you know, a 23-year-old woman, I'm like, I obviously nobody wants to be called it, but it's not something where people are afraid of like saying it to each other, if that makes sense. Like people just use it in this very casual kind of like friendly loving way, which is so interesting to think about. And it's really just kind of, I don't know, it's, I'm not like an expert in reclaiming language or anything, but it's interesting being able to kind of contribute to that and kind of have people also spark a dialogue around it. But it is also meant to just be kind of like a clickbaity title. Like it's just meant to be kind of like fun, and like there is some, you know, like serious social implications alongside reclaiming a word, but at the same time, it's just meant to kind of catch people's eye and make them say like, "What is this book? Like, what is going on in it?" And I hope it works. It seems like it has.
Well, and it's something that families can explore together, right? Like when it comes to language and the reclaiming of language and who has permission to use it and what grants them that permission. And context is everything, because when it's a book title and it's Revenge of the Sluts and it's a YA fictitious thing, but then like if someone's being called that vehemently in confrontation on the street when you're by yourself and alone, that's a whole other thing, right? Like, so opportunity to actually discuss with young people context and how context actually in many ways shapes our emotional and embodied experiences of all kinds of things, especially language, and how we treat people and the language we use in our conversation with them, and what's acceptable and what isn't, and who's into it and experiences it as endearment and who doesn't, and is there generation, is it, you know, like all those sort of that's great conversation to be having with young people, about topics of sexuality that then we can concretely shift into more personal dialogue and reveal meaning in terms of what this means for young people personally, for sure. So I
Yeah,
know I really appreciate that part of it.
yeah, I think the key thing about Revenge of the Sluts is that the girls are calling themselves that. There's nobody in the book who's who is being given the title without them wanting it. Like it's very much a personal decision for them to call themselves that and to publicly call themselves that. And I do think it's a really kind of interesting point to just kind of figure out like where people fall on that and what that means, and why is it different when somebody calls themselves that versus when somebody else says it to them, that kind of idea. I mean, it doesn't seem like it would be that big of a discussion, but it's a really important one. It's one that should be had, and it's one that, you know, I think can be weird and tricky, but it's important.
Yeah, and reveals a lot about gender, all kinds of social identities in terms of social power dynamics and everything too that are so prevalent in high school life, and happening all the time. So should we, do you want to shift a little bit to see if there are any Q&A or any questions that our host might have for us as
Yeah.
well?
Yeah, we do have a couple questions here. And one of them feeds right into what you were just talking about a little bit. So you mentioned your response, how the responses differ versus age. Have you seen any differences between genders? Have boys been reading the book? Have they been responding to it in any way for you?
I would love to have, I'm going to be totally honest, I would love to have more male reviewers. There really have not been that many. I've had a couple who've responded very, very well to the book, but they're mostly, I want to say like older. Like it's definitely more of like like grown-ups who are picking it up, like parents rather than like teenagers. I would love to hear what teenage boys have to say about this book. Like,
Yeah.
I think that would just be really wonderful and really helpful in understanding kind of how they actually take the book and how they understand it. I think it would be really exciting. Yeah, I've gotten a couple of like young kind of teen reviewers who've gotten back and have said that it was just a really like interesting, engaging read. So it would be, I don't know, I'm open to it. I would love for it.
Yeah. Did your brother read it?
Um, he's not much of a reader. He
Okay.
tried. My dad read it. My dad really enjoyed it, which was impressive. He, you know, doesn't read that much either, but
Yeah.
I couldn't get my brother to do it. And I was
One day. Yeah, my brother was not a reader either. So I totally get it from one reader to another. I have questions written down all over the place, but let's see. We had a couple others in the chat. Um, Oh, this could be for both of you. Are there any books that are considered classics or taught in high school classes that would make a good companion text with your book or disrupt the text mission? So,
Um, so in terms of resources, I think there's a wide variety. I mean, part of why I actually wrote my book was because I felt like there wasn't a place parents could go to find where those are. And that when I travel, I consult nationally, and when I go to different states and different schools, the questions were always the same. Parents had the same questions, kids had the same questions, whether I was in Utah or Boston, or Massachusetts or Pennsylvania or down south in California, like wherever I was, Colorado, the questions were the same. And so I think part of what Natalie is talking about, and why this book is so important, is because sex education in this country is pretty abysmal. And there are some amazing people doing amazing work, certainly, but for the vast majority of teenagers, they aren't getting a positive, sort of, informative sex education that will actually be useful in their real lives and relationships later in life. Um, and so I think there was really a need to address that. So, I'd like to think that in many ways I tried to answer that need with what I wrote myself. And when I did the proposal and looking at sort of what else is out there, Isabella Rothman has some great work. She did it's like a comic, it's like a graphic novel. It's called Wait What for middle school kids, which is fantastic. She just came out with one that was like a basics on consent. Heather Carina wrote Sex, Everything You Need to Know to Get Through Your Teens and 20s. The second edition is phenomenal. I mean, not that the first isn't, but the second edition is the one I would get. And it's the textbook I use in my class. As far as websites go, Rutgers University has a great sex ed resource. Columbia University, Go Ask Alice. Scarleteen is phenomenal. That is my go-to. I think Scarleteen has the most inclusive, most diverse, most, proactively validating, positive, responsible, all those things that we want as parents, our kids to understand about sexuality. Like it's all in this one website. And Heather Carina, who founded it, is also the author of the book I was talking about. And she co-authored Wait What with Isabella Rotman, who did the illustrations, and Heather did the writing for that middle school book. The Roby's books, It's Not the Stork. Those are good ones to start when kids are really, really early on. Sex is a Funny Word is great for like little elementary school people. There really are some fantastic resources across the developmental stages. For talking about this in particular, I'd say Heather Carina's book addresses, social media, addresses sexually explicit media. My book does as well. If you want to know more, Peggy Orenstein's books, Girls and Sex and Boys and Sex, she really reports on sort of what we need to instill in our children in terms of skills and because of what's going on, and how kids are working, within this dynamic and these issues, with these issues, and what's going on in the culture that sort of fuels that. So those are some great books too, for sure.
Okay, thank you. And just because we haven't said it on screen, but it's in the chat, but your book is titled Sex, Teens, and Everything in Between. So I just want to give a shout out to your title.
Thank you.
We haven't said it out loud, but it's there. It's in the chat. And you mentioned something. I'm just tying into what you were finishing with, and seeing if Natalie has a feeling on what it was like to write this book, or go through the publishing process during the last presidency. Did you feel any pressure, or were you driven even further to finish and get it out?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, actually. For me, I was writing the book, I want to say, at the very, very early stages of the Weinstein case. So, I mean, I was writing this back in like 2017, I want to say. So it was a really, really interesting time. So it wasn't even just the presidency and kind of dealing with this political turmoil and kind of
Mhm.
like kind of that feeling of what is going on, what are we supposed to expect, what is happening. It was also like watching kind of everything that was unfolding and all of the accusations that were coming forward, kind of everything that was the discussion that we were having around things like Me Too and what we should do about sexual harassment policy. I mean, everything that was happening was the reason like I wrote my thesis on sexual harassment in the first place, and I think it did fuel a lot of my book, and it was kind of a place for me to almost like, I don't want to say like rage, like yeah, exactly. It was a place for me to kind of put all of this feeling and everything that I was watching happen. And it's, I was like 19, 20 years old. I'm like, I don't know what else to do, so I'm just gonna write it. Like I'm just gonna create this little like fictional world and talk about it and explore what these all mean and what this could lead to and where we're going to go from here and everything. So yeah, it was definitely a really, I think, interesting time. And I honestly don't know how much of the book like would have happened had I not seen everything that was going on in the news and kind of had this growing awareness of what was going on. I'm not sure. I think there was a lot of influence. Like it's hard to separate kind of the time I was writing the book in and the book itself.
Yeah, very true. Very true. Let's see, we had a couple other questions in here. We had one question wondering what kind of thriller books you like to read. So if you have any mystery or thriller recommendations, we'll challenge Rachel in the chat to find those links quickly.
Yeah, I am a huge Karen Slaughter fan, like huge, huge, huge. That was my mom's recommendation. I love the Will Trent series. I think the way that Karen Slaughter writes her characters is so interesting. I love Gillian Flynn, of course. I'm sure anyone who's asking about thrillers has read her stuff already. But I think again, her characters are wonderful, and the way that she writes about women in particular is just so interesting and so like groundbreaking in so many ways. And Sharp Objects in particular was like a game changer for me. I think I like never reread books, but I reread Sharp Objects probably 3 or 4 times. Trying to think. I've read all of Tess Gerritsen's books, all of the Rosalian Isles. Those are like a really interesting, kind of fun series for me. Riley Sager, of course. Just again, another really interesting exploration of kind of like female characters and how to write about women and how to write thrillers and what that actually means and what you can do with the genre. Yeah, it's definitely, I have a couple of like standout favorites.
Very nice. I was like frantically trying to write a question down and I lost it, but because I was thinking about it, and it made me really think about. So I want to ask if there are any books that you read as a child or a teen that you revisited as an adult or where you are now and saw entirely different. For example, and I'm going to forget the title of it now. The Awakening. I read that in high school and I absolutely hated it and I didn't understand the character whatsoever. And then I had to read it in college and I was like, I totally get it. I see why she did it. Is there any book like that or character that maybe you didn't understand? And then as you grew up and experienced more of the world, you really saw something different? Because I think that's, especially for female characters for me, it's like, oh, like I thought she was a horrible person in the first time I read it because she, I don't want to do any spoilers for people who haven't read that classic, but it's a lot about the stress of being a mother and a wife and not having your own dreams. And she makes some really interesting decisions towards the end. So, but do you have any books like that or characters?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing that really comes to mind for me, I've always honestly struggled with classics. That's one of those things where I was
Me
always
too.
like, I was definitely one of those high school students who was like, oh, I can't believe we have to read this. But I definitely, my appreciation for like Jane Austen in particular, that's one of those where I'm, definitely not the first person to ever say this, but like her books started to make so much sense to me as I got older. Like it was originally kind of one of those like, oh my God, why does my mom love this book so much? Like, why does she constantly talk about Pride and Prejudice specifically? Like, what does this all mean? And then it was as I got older, I really started to kind of understand the characters and just what it all meant. And then another thing that stands out when you talk about classics for me is The Scarlet Letter, which I read when I was in high school. And there are some pretty, like, I think, clear parallels. So it'd actually be really interesting to have somebody do, I think, like a Scarlet Letter and Revenge of the Sluts kind of like side by side. I think the Scarlet Letter is so interesting, and that when I was reading it in high school, I had this feeling of like, we can do more. Like we could absolutely, like we should have a modern version of this, and the fact that we don't is really a shame. I mean, we have ECA, which is a
Yep.
wonderful resource,
I love
but
it.
yeah, exactly. But in terms of like books that we can offer, where if somebody wants something a little bit more modern than Scarlet Letter, it's there's not really like we have some options, but it's not like a huge genre, and it's really something where I think that's such a shame, where we need to talk a little bit more about, slut
Mhm.
shaming and kind of what that means and the societal pressures that women face and everything like that. So it's yeah, I think Scarlet Letter was one of those where it was always kind of in the back of my mind while I was writing Revenge of the Sluts, which is interesting. So I honestly didn't like the book that much. I had a lot of kind of qualms with it, but it's one of those like I think if you were, I think part of it was wanting to have something so people didn't have to read the Scarlet Letter to understand, slut shaming and be able to connect with the themes of the book.
Nice. Shafia, do you have anything like that?
I have lots of things like that. I feel like, you know, at 50, it's like, all these different stages in my life were reading books and then going back and rereading them or referencing them again with more just experiential context in life, I think provides
Mhm.
so much perspective. Like Virginia Woolf's A Room of Her Own, of One's Own, is like definitely one for me. Shakespeare is huge. Um,
Mhm.
I could not understand Shakespeare. I did not understand what anyone was saying. I think I can't even imagine what grade, if I even got a grade in Shakespeare when I was in high school. But then it ended up being like my senior thesis and inspired me to become a health teacher in some ways, because so many of the issues that are talked about in Shakespeare, like I think of A Midsummer Night's Dream, right? In terms of sexual harassment, assault, like all those issues, double standards, gendered issues, love, right? Like unrequited love and young love between feuding families. I mean, think about that in the polarization that existed within Romeo and Juliet, and the star-crossed lovers. I mean, all those things which are themes that come up in my classes all the time. Um, so definitely that. I was a huge fan of Judy Blume, and Judy Blume in many ways got me through, early adolescence, and I'm grateful to that for that. But I read those books now, and think about them in context and sort of what they mean, and do I want my own daughters to read them? I have three kids, two girls and a boy. And yeah, and talking about them. I feel that way with movies though too, like
Mhm.
older movies. I'm so excited to show my kids and we start watching them, like 16 Candles or something like that. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that is coercion, that is non-consensual. Like, and you really sort of see how socialization takes place,
Mhm.
um, in implicit and explicit ways. The Breakfast Club. I mean, there's so much. So not to move
Yeah.
away from books too much, but I feel like
Media.
in talking, yeah, media and talking to young people about this stuff, like I love this trifecta, the three Easy A, Scarlet Letter, and Revenge of the Sluts. I would do a whole class on that. I think that would be amazing. I'm going to offer that as an elective, and
Great.
like, for one semester, because that would be amazing. So anyway, thank you for the ask. But yeah, The Mists of Avalon. I don't know if
Mm.
anybody has read that book, but that is a very underrated feminist book. I feel like The Mists of Avalon. In I think I'm remembering the right one.
Yes, that's the King Arthur one.
Yes,
Yes, with
from the
Morgan.
perspective of the women.
Yes, of the women of
Yes,
the Lady of the Lake. Yeah, yeah.
yes,
I was obsessed
that.
with King Arthur, so I watched the miniseries, and then I tried to read the book. I'm not sure if I finished it. I was a little young, I think, but I probably still have it somewhere.
Oh, the book's so much better.
I know it always is. It always is.
Always is. Yes.
Yeah, but I just couldn't wait. I needed to know all about the story, so I did see it. And there's a lot of other titles that are that are coming out now. Specifically, the ones that came to mind were Cersei and Song of Achilles, that are taking these old classics, of Achilles and what's the other one? It's a Greek. I can't. The Odyssey, I think, and just taking the point of view of the women that were
Yeah.
so such minor characters or just like tools within that story. Are there any classics or even just tropes that you would love to see rewritten in the form, in the perspective of a woman or of the woman in the story?
Joseph Conrad's books, like Heart of Darkness.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think, I mean, now I'm sort of dating myself, right, in terms of what were the classics and what I
I read
studied
it.
in school.
Yeah, I agree.
But like, can you imagine Heart of Darkness from the perspective of the Congolese women? Like,
Horror.
I think that would be
Yeah.
incredible.
Mm-hmm.
So I start to think of things like that for sure.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to think of other sort of classics that, and I love this idea of the Odyssey, Homer's work from the perspective of the sirens. Like, what
Mm-hmm.
about that,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
The crazy women on the rock.
Yeah,
I think
I
that would
read
be,
Song of Achilles and I was like bawling my eyes out towards the end. And I kind of for somehow missed what it was about. Like I listened to it on audio and I think I was like, oh, people love that book. And I didn't read the description. It had been years since that people were talking about it. And I was like, I did not, this is not what I expected, but it was beautiful. It's beautifully done. Natalie, do you have anything that you can
I
think of? It's a hard question. So
Yeah, it really
yeah.
is. No, that's a really, really interesting question. I honestly like I don't know. I mean, I'm sure there's so because it's one of those things where like I love when people come forward and they have something like that where it's this retelling or a really interesting way of framing a story or like just a I don't know, like something interesting that makes me rethink kind of what I read. But I'm like, I can't think of anything right now. I'm feeling of like something I've forgotten every book I've ever heard of.
Yeah.
what about Hemingway, right? Like, For Whom the Bell Tolls. Like, I
Yeah.
mean, some of those would be amazing, written from the perspective
Yeah.
um,
Yeah,
of
his
a
women
female.
I've read a few of his books and it's been a long time, but I feel like his women are like simultaneously very deep but also very like surface level. If I
Yeah.
like they I think he writes them in such a or he wrote them in such an interesting way. Because I think my favorite Hemingway book is The Sun Also Rises, and I
Yes.
feel like the woman in that book really shocked me. And I don't even know her name. I don't even remember a lot of her plot, but I just remember there's like a scene between them that I was like, wow, that was really deep. And it was like, a one-page scene, and that made me fall like really feel for that woman. So, but yeah, I would love to see his books written that way. I was thinking the like silly one, and I'm keeping an eye on the clock to make sure we have one more question. But Mighty Ducks, that was something I thought of the other day. I was like, there were one, maybe two girls, depending on which one you're watching, and the mom, right? Like
Yeah.
I would love to see, because we get the token girl a lot, right? On
Hmm.
sports. I love sports movies for some reason, and we get a token girl every time. There's so many token girls. And I would love, I don't really, I would like to know what the girl who is the token girl, I want to know her perspective. If you're the only girl in a group of guys, that's a fun, funny, or could be scary or disheartening story all in the same. Mighty Ducks hopefully would be funny, but you know, there's a lot of stories where you get the one token girl, and I would just love to see more written about that. But definitely do a class. One of the questions in here, which I think is really hard, so I don't know if we have enough time to dive into it, but I'll ask it just in case, was if you could design a high school literature reading list, what books would you include? So Natalie, I'll start with you on that one if you can think of
Yeah,
any.
no, that's really interesting. I'm a weird person to ask about it because most of I mean, growing up, I was very heavily oriented toward like young adult contemporary, like have
Mhm.
always been. That was just like what I found really interesting and approachable. So I think it would definitely be structured in a way that's mostly focused around kind of like modern issues written from modern authors, if that makes sense, and then almost trying to find parallels between older books because I always really like when history can kind of be brought forward. So it's you learn the stuff and you kind of learn to love reading and you learn to pick up on the themes. And then you're presented with something that might be a little bit more difficult to read because maybe the language is a little more inaccessible or something like that. I've always liked that kind of like side by side of here's something that's a little bit easier, like an entry point, something where it's familiar to you because the characters have like cell phones and they use lingo that you know. And then here's a book that tackles similar concepts, but is older and might not be as approachable. But yeah, I mean, I don't have any like particular titles in mind or anything like that, but that's definitely kind of the direction that I personally would take. I really like that kind of side by side parallel.
Yeah, and there was like a trend heading that way. I think a lot of schools are starting to pair. I know when Hunger Games was big, they were starting to put Hunger Games into the curriculum. And I don't remember exactly what they were pairing it with, but they were pairing it with something along with classics. And, you know, I think there's a lot of really great modern books out there that are retellings or reimaginings of the stories. Like I'm trying to think of her. I think Siobhan Vivian. Oh gosh, no, I think that's the wrong name. No, I need to have all these books. I need to research them. There's one. It's not Siobhan Vivian, who is great by the way, but not her. It's one that has. But she wrote a retelling of The Talented Mr. Ripley, and it was a female, and it's a teen book, and I will think of it. If Rachel or Heidi in the background can think of this book, I hosted her a while ago, so it's gonna drive me crazy. But I think, you know, having that, I agree with you, partnering like a classic with a more modern retelling or has the same themes is the way to go. Shafia, do you have anything? Do you have a list, since you are a teacher?
You know, well, and there's so many new ones. Like I feel like there's so many books and there's so many books that existed when we were all reading the classics that just weren't integrated into curriculum, right? Like so there were all kinds. Zora Neale Hurston's work is amazing. I mean, she's one of my personal heroes. You know, The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. Like I think in terms of coming of age. So when I taught English literature and was also simultaneously teaching health, I tried to, you know, select books and advocate for books that actually brought up all those coming of age issues. And so much of the time, I feel like in English departments, we focus on loss of innocence versus like the gaining of wisdom, perspective, and maturity. And so I actually consult with a lot of English departments around this because there's always this like, you know, void and that there's this profound grief and loss, but we never talk about the joy and what we aspire to that's actually really beautiful moving forward, that's empowering. So, you know, I appreciate a lot the different sort of, I mean, and being in literary, you know, studies major myself, I just had some more classics, but more diverse, I think, poetry that was out there of you know, like I think of I'm spacing on the one right now, is Rites of Passage for Young Boys. It was written by an author who's a professor at Stanford University. I bought my book at a Books Inc. I remember I bought it at a Books Inc. When it had come out like 15 years ago. But you know, I just think coming of age stories that have a really good balance between like, okay, what are the things that we're moving on from, and then what are the things we're moving on towards, and that there isn't so much this like focus always on this loss of innocence, but rather navigating the gauntlet towards adulthood in a way that's empowering and something to look forward to where there's a gain as well. And I think of protagonists like Janie in Their Eyes Were Watching God and how amazing that was for her. In terms of her story, her narrative, and how it comes back around. And it's telling it to her best friend. Like, I mean, that's such an adolescent experience. So I would just say in terms of guidelines, you know, finding those coming of age stories that really resonate with young people, but that also provide a different perspective from what's always been the historical canon, right? Like that have always been pushed.
Yeah,
for sure.
You think about the canon that we're talking about. I mean, a lot of the classics that we're talking about, they're not exactly happy books. So it's, I think, you know, adding this conversation to something that's kind of hopeful is always very nice. So fingers crossed we get more books like this. I did think I searched secretly through my my list of audiobooks that I listened to, and it's E. Lockhart's Genuine Fraud was the Talented Mr. Ripley retelling that I was trying to think of. So
You
But
did it. So you don't have to have your 2 a.m. bolt of like, oh, I just remembered.
I was like, I'm going to sneakily just look. I know it's one of the first ones I listened to, so I can go all the way down. But I do want to ask this one question before, because we are coming up to our time. Natalie, do you have anything new in the works that you can
Yeah,
talk about?
yeah, nothing far. It'll be very much similar to Revenge of the Sluts. That's the goal, is to kind of stay in that theme of kind of integrating Rip from the Headlines with just like teen issues and kind of understanding how to navigate that, and then also combining like my interest in like sociology and understanding people and things like that. So that's kind of the hope, is to continue on this pathway of kind of like almost like social issue teen drama to really like simplify it. But that's like about as far as I've gotten with it. So
Nice. Shafia, do you have anything?
College. So my book is, there's like 100 scenarios in my book that are told by teenagers. They're all real stories that I've heard through my, my work over the 25 years I've been doing this, and, selected the most relevant ones. And so the next piece is going to be, okay, so what are the stories coming out of college? So I have this phenomenal crew of college students right now who are writing, transcribing, reporting on everything they're seeing, thinking, and feeling on college campuses. And then we're going to actually organize those and create some commentary and dialogue and provide resources so that for those kids who didn't get the education they needed and how to apply that to what's going on for them in college, they'll have access to sex positive sex education, basically through the narratives of actual college students.
Very nice, very interesting. Natalie, are you going to stick with YA? Or are you going to jump into the adult world, or the one that's not aged to 18? Or are you going to do college age characters? Or?
I think for now I'll be kind of in YA. I hope that I can write college at some point. I think exploring that is something that we're really missing, especially in fiction. That's just not something we're really exploring that much. I would eventually love to get into adult fiction. I don't have any sort of like set goals of like, oh yeah, by the time I hit like 28, I'm going to be writing exclusively adult fiction. Like there's no sort of like set kind of time frame or anything. It's just more of a, whenever I come up with like that idea, I'll be trying to write it.
Very nice, very nice. I'm just checking to make sure we don't have any last minute important questions. It looks like a bunch of links for all the books that we were talking. Rachel is finding them, so make sure.
There's also, just so you know, because it just came out and I just got my copy at BooksInc in my neighborhood. Emma Brown just came out with a new book on raising a boy.
Yes.
And it's all about masculinity, and that's a really interesting one, I think, in particular. And if we focus more on that, then we'll have more male readers who can comment on books like Natalie's in meaningful ways. And then also Kara Notterson's books are a pretty phenomenal resource too.
Yeah. Natalie, are you thinking of focusing on any boy issues? I'm going to put that in quotes because I don't know a better way to phrase it right now off the top of my head, but.
Yeah, I would love to. That was something that I really kind of dug into with Revenge of the Sluts, was realizing I like writing about women, and I like writing about kind of what it feels like to be a teen girl and what that kind of dynamic is like. But I think writing about like men would be really interesting. I think exploring masculinity and kind of understanding what that actually means and what that looks like, and everything would just be so exciting and just really, I think, could spark some really interesting conversations. So yeah, that's definitely, I'm a little bit nervous about approaching it, but like I'm not scared to. Like it's something where it'll be a lot of work, I think, but it'll be like worth it.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much for tonight's conversation. I really enjoyed it. And I am super excited for both of your books to be out there and to be promoting them to teens and parents alike. So thank you so much. For those of you in attendance, we do have a special 15% coupon code specifically for our attendees. So I'll be emailing it out, but it is valid from tonight till to next Thursday. So a full week. I said that oddly, but a full week. It is valid, and it is for both Revenge of the Sluts, and this is why I always forget titles as soon as I say them. It is for both Revenge of the Sluts and Sex Teens and everything in between. So you can go over to booksinc.net and find those books. And when you enter into the checkout process, just enter the code. It is nice and easy. Natalie Walton, one word. So I will be emailing it out to all registered attendees via Eventbrite. So keep an eye out for that later this evening. And if you did receive if you did purchase a copy through Eventbrite, you also received the 15% discount. So just want to say that. And then your books will ship out this week. So thank you so much. And I hope you both have a lovely night. And I'll hopefully be able to talk to you soon, another day, in person maybe. So
Thank you for
so
having
much.
us.
Have a great night. Bye-bye,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Bye.